Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our coverage of the 2014 Rapid World Chess Championships. We're in round 7 for today's coverage. White's going to be played by Quang, Liem. If you're not too familiar with this guy, he won last year in the Blitz Championship, so he is no stranger to fast chess, one of the top in the world last year, being able to win the Blitz format. His opponent playing the black pieces, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but Ian Nepo. I'm just going to call him Ian. I can't pronounce his last name, so we'll just call him Ian for today, or the black pieces. So definitely interesting match. Ian was, again, for those who didn't kind of follow the coverage, yesterday he was leading the pack going into day 2. So two extremely talented players going in to round 7. So I thought it would be interesting to watch these two duke it out. Quang Liem decides to start with pawn to d4, knight f6, knight f3, pawn to g6, and then bishop here to f4. I always like to cover matches that play something different, and so I thought this one was pretty cool, not only because there are some great players, but you just don't see kind of the London system very often. The London system playing pawn to d4, an early development of a bishop here to f4, usually solidify the pawn chain of pawn to e3, pawn here to c3. I think this is a pretty good way to actually play rapid chess. You do have a very aggressive dark square bishop, which for white can be sometimes challenging because usually it just kind of stays back here on c1, but you don't really get into many complicated lines because your pawn structure is pretty solid. You're not really trying to do too many crazy exchanges in the center of the board. You're kind of waiting, developing your pieces, not doing anything too crazy. First few moves from both sides are pretty self-explanatory. Black's going to fianchetto on the king side, getting ready to castle. Pawn here to e3. Again, I made a video on the London system if you'd like to kind of check that out, but these are all pretty basic moves from both sides. Pawn here to h2 or h3. This does allow for the bishop, if he ever wants to bring it back here to h2. Interesting idea if he ever wants to kind of attack the queen side. So white in this particular opening, he can castle on the king side and then throw everything in the kitchen sink at the queen side. He can also try to attack on the king side as well. So he kind of is leaving himself some options. He could get pretty aggressive with his bishop, or he could decide to go ahead and bring it back here to h2, kind of a safe square. Pawn to c5, black's going to do some counterattacking in the center of the board. Also wants to kind of open up the door for his knight to get involved. Pawn to c3, again, London system as we talked about. Capture, recapture. So this does open up a semi-open file for white if he ever wants to bring his rook over here to e1, kind of control this. That's kind of where the rooks, do best, as kind of these semi-open files or open files. They have more room to roam around, so that's going to be good. Bishop here to e2, not necessary to play a pawn forward to get the bishop involved, but does want to make sure that he can castle pretty quickly. Pawn here to b6, getting ready to bring his bishop involved. Castle on the king side. Bishop there to b7, controlling this long diagonal right here. Rook over here to e1, as we talked about. Just develop both sides, developing pieces, getting him into the best position on board. Knight to d7, doesn't want to block off his bishop here on b7. Knight to d2, he does have this pawn chain right here, so this is really the only option that he has. He can later, if he wants to bring it over here to b3, he can formulate some sort of outpost here on c5 later into the game. He could play a little bit more aggressive of, knight to e4. He could try to exchange off a piece if black ever wanted to come down, trade off, then the knight can go ahead and recapture. So a lot of different options with this knight here on d2. Ian now brings his queen to c7, completing his development. So all of his pieces are developed. He's castled on the king side. Both of his rooks are connected. So Ian can start to kind of formulate a game plan. If we look at what he should really do, he has one semi-open file, so we have the C file, so looking to bring his rook over here to C8 makes a lot of sense. You usually want to have your other rook kind of fall behind one of your central pawns. He hasn't moved his E-pawn yet, so rook to E8 makes a lot of sense to me, then pushing forward with pawn to E5, counterattacking, but again, early on, your rook's kind of need to be behind your pawns pushing forward or controlling those long files. He also does have his bishops both controlling these long diagonals right here. He could look to get his knight here on d7 a little bit more active. If we look over here from Quang, Liem, as far as what he wants to do, he wants to complete his development. So he can get his queen involved. He can bring it here to c2, b3 if he wants to be a little bit more aggressive. Needs to figure out what he wants to do with this bishop. This bishop here on e2 isn't very aggressive. He could bring it over here to c4. d3 is also fine as well. It's still kind of controlling the center of the board. His king's safe, so that's fine. Just a few moves, and he's going to be completing his development and continuing with his game plan. White's now going to bring his bishop back to h2. Kind of a waiting move. Don't know that it's necessary right now, but that's fine. Black does have to keep an eye on this. You sometimes lose this bishop here on h2 and forget that it's there. So if he wants to ever try something with pawn to e6, he has to make sure that he has something protecting this pawn here on d6. The rook's going to swing over here to d8. Questionable move, I think. Makes more sense to me just to play rook here to c8. But, you know, in a fast game of chess, sometimes you try some different stuff out. Bishop back here to f1. Also questioning this. You do want to kind of open up for this rook on e1 to control the semi-open file. But bishop to d3 solves the same thing. So bishop to f1 seems a little bit passive to me, but that's what was played in the game. Rook here to e8. That makes sense. Bishop here to b3. We've now completed development on the white side, and so both teams going into the middle game here. We have the queen come back here to c8. Also doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think a more aggressive approach may have been bishop to d5. Very central square for the bishop. It wasn't doing too much back here on b7, kind of forcing white to do something. Queen to c8 doesn't to me seem aggressive, doesn't seem to be protecting any pieces that really need protecting, so somewhat of a questionable move from Ian in this particular case. Pawn to a4, so Lee decides to go ahead and start pushing on the queen side, so definitely has that option. This bishop here on f1 is protecting the push up the board, so definitely has that. Pawn to a6, this kind of stops any momentum here on b5, so this pawn on a4 also acting as an outpost if the bishop wants to come up here to b5, but pawn to e6 kind of stops any of that. We now see pawn pushing forward to a5. Black has a few options. He could just push forward with b5. He could also capture. He decided to push down with b5. I think that's a lot better. It gets a little tricky if, black takes here on a5, and then we see the rook come up here and capture. The queen can come to c7, threatening here. The rook can now swing over to a1, putting a lot of pressure again on this pawn. He's also attacking the bishop here on b7. His bishop here on f1 is also eyeing down on the square on a6. This just gets really, really complicated. In my opinion, way too much pressure on the queen side that black doesn't necessarily have to deal with. So again, you don't always have to capture your opponent's material. In this particular case, pawn to b5 kind of stops the forward momentum here on the queen side, and definitely the better choice, I think, that Ian could have taken. Pawn to c4, kind of breaking this up, decides to go ahead and capture. The bishop recaptures here on c4. I think this gives Lee a small advantage. Anytime you can capture and gain control of the center of the board, get one of your minor pieces a little bit more active, I think that's a little better off for white in this position. So as we look at both sides, white has a pretty active position. Both of his bishops are doing their job nicely. This rook over here on a1 is supporting this pawn, but can't really do too much, so he may decide to go ahead and bring it somewhere else. Maybe this open c file makes a lot of sense, hopefully. We also have the rook here on e1 controlling. From black's position, he's a little cramped. He would really like to get his rook over here to c8, maybe even over here to b8. The rooks both here make a lot of sense. He would like to get his knights a little bit more active, so this bishop here on d7 can do something. The queen back here on c8, again, as we talked about, isn't doing much at all. I don't really understand why he brought it back there. So if we look at this, black's a little cramped. White definitely has a more active position. Now pawn to a d5, kind of stopping the attack again. The bishop and the queen are both attacking the square on f7. So d5 really makes the most sense. Pawn to e6 again gets a little tricky because black can't forget about this bishop here on h2. Can come in, swing in, capture this pawn here on d6. That's definitely going to be bad. So really the only option that Ian has here is to play pawn to a d5. The bishop's going to swing back here to d3. Still central square. Queen a8. We do kind of have this barrel here protecting the pawn, but again, black's kind of in the defense mode. He doesn't really have any aggression going on at all. Rook swing over here to a c1, controlling this long file. Bishop to c6. I don't like this move. Again, it's super easy as you're doing commentary, especially in a rapid game. They just don't have a lot of time. But rook to c8, challenging those files. You never just want your opponent to control file. And bishop here to c6 not only doesn't control that file, but it's just kind of sitting here protecting pieces. You're just using your bishop to kind of block off this entire file. So for that reason, I just think there was more active squares for black to go. Queen comes back here to d1. Knight to e4. Nice little outpost, but you know, white can always just capture if he wants to. But pawn to b4. Lee decides to go ahead and start pushing on the queen side. Now the rook's going to swing over here to c8, so definitely like that. Maybe a little bit too late, but that's okay. Queen to e2. Then we see an exchange right here. The bishop's going to come back to a b7. A knight over here to a b3. Definitely do not want to fall into any traps, so both sides have to be very aware of what's going on from both sides of the board. Rook coming down to c1, capture. Pawn to e5. So black has waited this entire time to counterattack in the center of the board. He has two central pawns. His opponent has one, so he thought this would be a good time to attack. Again, Ian really needed to move his knight to f6. Had a nice exchange, and now he can go ahead and attack in the center of the board. After the pawn takes and the knight recaptures here on e5, all of a sudden black has a passed pawn. It does have quite a few moves that it's going to have to get down here to d1, but white for the rest of the game is going to have to worry about that pawn. Now both sides are equal in material. It's about even on board right now. Both sides have a few things they have going for them. Pretty active positions on both sides. The queen on a8 is not very, very active, but you know, black does have this passed pawn here on d5 that white's really going to have to deal with the rest of the game. Knight to c5, nice little outpost move. And then we see just the exchange of some of the pieces. The queen here to d3, pushing forward a little bit, again, still protected by this bishop over here on g7. And then a few more pieces come off the board. So we're starting to get towards the end game. So it's always interesting in this particular case because, again, it is pretty even. Black is attacking this pawn here on b4, so white has to be somewhat careful. But white also has to just be very aware of this pawn here on d4. White now plays bishop here to d6. He recognizes that this pawn is going to be something he's going to have to worry about. And black really wants to bring his rook over here to d8. He wants to have it be right behind this pawn, controlling this entire file. He can start to push up the board. So white's actually going to bring his bishop over here to b6. It's a nice little outpost. Typically you want to have your outpost in the center of the board, but it's not always the worst thing on the side of the board, especially right here for white. With his bishop here on b6, he can kind of control the square on d8, so this is definitely going to be very, very good for white. Pawn to h5, and then we kind of see this series that we talked about. Now the rook is kind of forced to try different approaches, so he tries rook here to e6, and it's very important that white continues with his game plan. He doesn't want to play bishop taking here on d4, because then you could see queen over here to d7, and this is actually very, very bad. White's going to go down in material because he now has all these attackers on the square. He can even get his rook involved if white tries to get his rook, so definitely going to be bad. So, but in the game, you know, Lee decides to go ahead and just continue with bishop here to b6, recognizing that there is a trap that Ian was trying to set for him. King to h7, rook over here to d1, putting a lot of pressure on that pawn. Then rook over here to e5, queen over here to f3. Definitely an interesting move right here. White definitely has to make sure that he is keeping an eye on the square over here on a b4. Queen to e7. And then we see pawn here to a g3. And this is definitely one of those moves that I think is pretty interesting. You're never really sure exactly, what's going on. But, pawn here to g3, don't think it's quite necessary. Rook over here to f5. Queen comes back. There's going to be an exchange in material. But I think this just helps black a little bit better. His pieces are a lot more aggressive right now. White's rook here on d1 is kind of playing defense mode, where black kind of has all of his pieces on attack mode. So I think the few moves that we just had there, that the king's not really a lot safer. The pawn on g3 wasn't doing too much, so black has definitely put himself in a good position to kind of go for the win, because for a while they were kind of tied from both sides. Pawn to h4, trying to break up that. Queen back to d3. Definitely wants to make sure that he doesn't leave all of his pieces kind of sitting there. Pawn takes on g3. Then we see the queen come over. Bishop to f6. Black wants to start to get more of his pieces involved into the action. King to h1. Again, one of those moves that just kind of makes you question. I think it makes a lot more sense to get your queen back over here to d3, more of a centralized square. Your king right away is not in a ton of pressure, so bringing it over here to h1 somewhat loses a move. We now see the queen come over here to a4, and then rook to c1. Queen to a2, and then black just starts to attack. So we have both the queen and the rook now both attacking this pawn here on f2. It pushes forward, so now the rook's going to swing over, attacking these pieces over here. Rook swings over here to f1, protecting this pawn. And then the rook's going to get involved anytime your opponent has their queen and their rook all up inside your business down here. It's definitely going to be very difficult to hold on for too much longer. The queen comes down, rook comes down here to b2, attacking it. A few more moves, getting it into position again. Both sides now attacking, or both of these pieces attacking the square in h3. So the king's forced to add a little bit. Queen to d6, now attacking both this bishop and this pawn right here. The rook swings up here to f2. Not really sure exactly what this piece going on f2 is doing. Queen to e4 is a lot more aggressive, still holds on to the pawn on f4, but also attacks kind of the center of the board. It's going to be hard to really do too much, but it still seems better than rook here to f2. Again, both sides getting low on time, so they don't have a ton of time to think, because even Ian, he's in a good position, but king to g7, pretty defensive move. He's not really under attack at all. He could have easily played bishop here to h4, continuing the pressure, all of his pieces involved into the action. I think that's probably a somewhat missed opportunity for Ian on this particular board. So we have king to g7. Now the queen comes to e4. I think it's a little bit late because now this rook over here to e3 is actually just really, really difficult. He's just protecting all of his pieces nicely, and then he can actually start to push forward. So the rook comes back here to a3, and then black starts to push forward. So we have d3. You always want to stop your opponent's passed pawns, so the rook is kind of forced to this defense duty, making sure his opponent doesn't push forward. But bishop here to c3 kind of forces it to move, and then all of a sudden the queen's involved, check. After the king moves, the pawn comes down here to d2. There's just no way to kind of stop all this pressure, and after the rook comes down here to a1, the blitz champion from last year was forced to resign this particular case. So Ian having a really, really strong showing after leading after day one, continuing even in round 7. They play 5 rounds for the first 3 days, continuing how good he is at fast chess. So definitely an interesting game as it got towards the middle and end game. A few key decisions from both sides. Took a small error, and then it just escalated very, very quickly. And passed pawns, we talk about it all the time, but passed pawns are really, really difficult to deal with. If you have them, you need to push them and protect them because your opponent they can't do everything. And the more small things you can have against your opponents, it kind of add up, and then eventually, you know, one of those usually wins. So hopefully you guys are enjoying the coverage of the Rapid Championships. Hopefully you learned a little bit, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.